a top-secret site in Arkansas whose occupants carried the fate of the nation in their hands.
They would have been very aware of the fact that they could be the person that started a nuclear war.
An ancient ruin in Cambodia, ravaged by one man's cruel deception.
There were gun battles happening. They were fighting over the statues. Calling these blood antiquities makes a lot of sense.
And a facility in Wales, tainted by the actions of an international hero.
Winston Churchill is most remembered in history for leading Britain through the Second World War. But for some, his legacy is more complicated.
In northeast Arkansas are the sprawling remains of a secret site that stood guard over America during its most dangerous hour.
This place is huge. It's obviously been used for something very big.
You've got offices, you've got playgrounds, you've got athletic fields. There's all the makings of a proper town here.
But this was no normal town. It was built with a very specific purpose. One area in particular provides the first piece of the puzzle.
The most obvious feature here is clearly the runway. With all the housing and other facilities near the airfield, you'd have to assume this is part of the military.
These places were all around the country, and most people had no idea.
But what were they hiding?
Everything here was part of the nation's last line of defense during a time of perilous uncertainty.
The crews knew that if they were ever called upon to go aloft and use their payloads in battle, they would trigger World War III.
And for one terrifying instant, it looked like that moment had come.
This is the closest that we as a nation have ever come to nuclear war.
Joseph Alley is a historian who has spent almost 3 years uncovering what went on inside this clandestine facility.
Security was paramount. There were very specific places that you were allowed to go, and there were also places that you were explicitly forbidden to go. And this was all laid out to you on day one.
This is the Blytheville Air Force Base. It was first operational during World War II. But in the 1950s, as tension between Western democracies and the Soviet Empire mounted, it became part of America's frontline defenses in the Cold War.
In 1959, when the Strategic Air Command took this base over, this is where they were going to be making very important world-changing decisions.
So SAC, the Strategic Air Command, is essential to the Cold War effort. They're in charge of all the nuclear capabilities that come from the air.
A squadron of B-52 long-range bombers was based here, poised to counter the increasing communist threat.
So these big B-52s could carry a nuclear payload. And so they were meant to deter any adversary.
But as soon as the Strategic Air Command arrived at Blytheville to evaluate the base, they realized there was a critical flaw in their deterrent strategy. If the Soviets were to launch a first strike attack intended to cripple America's defenses, they would not have been able to retaliate fast enough.
SAC commanders understood that the U.S. was not ready to respond quickly to incoming nuclear threat. Something had to be done to remedy that, and fast.
You have to fuel these bombers, you have to get them out of their hangars onto the runway, you gotta put the right ordnance aboard. The average time to do all that, 6 hours. Well, if you're in a nuclear standoff and time is of the essence, that's way too long. And so Strategic Air Command decides it wants to get that down to 15 minutes.
By 1960, the construction of a new building designed to meet the rapid response objective was completed on this base.
So this is the Readiness Crew Building. This was a 70-man crew dormitory. They would do what was called an alert rotation. For 7 days, they would be living, eating, and working in the Readiness Crew Building.
The airfield's distinctive design was also a key part of the defense plan, if the pilots were called into action.
The shape of the tarmac was all about speed. The planes were fully fueled and armed on the branches, ready to pull out onto the runway at any moment's notice.
And then they're going to come up to the end of the runway at a specific angle so that they can very quickly take off. There's no stopping and turning. There's no having to work your way and arrange it. It's just boom, boom. Sometimes you would have one plane's tail fitted right up against one plane's nose. That's how close these guys would get.
The payload each bomber carried had the potential to inflict unimaginable devastation.
You had 5 B-52s. Each one was manned with 2 Hound Dog GAM-77 cruise missiles. Each of those cruise missiles was roughly 3 times as powerful as the nuclear weapons that were used on Japan at the end of World War II. You also have about 58 other bases all over the U.S., so you can figure out just how much destructive force the United States was capable of bringing to bear with just the flip of a switch.
And it's not long before they get the call.
In October of 1962, an American spy plane flies over Cuba, and they realize that there are missile bases being built on the Cuban islands by the Soviet Union. This was simply too close.
They could take out Miami or take out Washington, D.C. with no warning, really. So this triggers the Cuban Missile Crisis.
B-52s across the country were put on a 24-hour alert, and the ones here were no exception.
In this room, there was a meeting with all of the crewmen that were on alert at the time. It was explicitly explained. Things are getting tense with the Soviet Union. There's something happening down in Cuba, and the Strategic Air Command has officially notified us that they're going to be implementing what they called their 1/8 program. This means that 1 out of every 8 bombers in the Strategic Air Command is going to be in the air at all times.
This was all part of a wider plan called Operation Chrome Dome, which would run for 7 years. For 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, around 60 nuclear-armed bombers were circling the skies around America, ready to strike Cuba, the USSR, or elsewhere at a moment's notice. And as the Cuban Missile Crisis escalated, the threat edged ever closer.
So the aircraft at Blytheville Air Force Base are then raised to DEFCON 2, which is the highest defense readiness short of nuclear war.
In 1962, at Blytheville Air Force Base, the crews of B-52 nuclear bombers were on high alert after the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba. On October 24th, Strategic Air Command issued a new order. The crisis was about to enter a critical new phase.
They stepped up to DEFCON 2. That's just 1 step away from nuclear war.
The DEFCON Defense Readiness System prescribes 5 states of alert for the U.S. military.
At DEFCON 2, you are at your station, your finger is on the button, and then, of course, DEFCON 1 is pressing that button.
While the American people were aware that the country was on the brink of nuclear war, those inside this building knew that at any moment they could be called on to launch a strike.
The tensions were real, the stressors were real. This was an incredibly dangerous time.
You had this kind of cycle where guys would wake up and they would get their assignments and they would be in this building just sitting and waiting for that klaxon telling them that it is now DEFCON 1. They would have been very aware of the fact that they could be the person that started a nuclear war.
For 8 agonizing days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the personnel based here waited for the apocalypse to begin.
The purpose of these bases can be none other.
But behind the scenes, President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were negotiating.
Luckily, neither side really wanted to go to war. And so Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to come to a peaceful conclusion. Nobody was happy, but nobody was dead either.
The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US removing its missiles away from Turkey.
Blytheville and those stationed here continued to quietly guard the nation from the skies in the decades to come.
You've got thousands of people that are working to keep up the alert facilities, so you've got a veritable army of men and women who are working to keep the country safe.
As we move through the 1980s and the Cold War starts to ease, American military bases are being closed. And so Blytheville was on the chopping block.
Following its closure in 1992, Blytheville became a municipal airport, and the Ready Alert facility was permanently closed down. Now, Joseph and his team plan to turn this once top-secret site into a Cold War museum.
Originally, there were 59 alert facilities over the continental US. This is the last one that is fully intact. This is the last one that the public will ever be able to visit. And so we are very proud to be able to take on a project like this.
In northern Cambodia is the ruin of an ancient site caught in the middle of a modern-day scandal.
On the ground, we can see we're kind of in Indiana Jones territory. There are ruined temples, there are stone carvings, pillars, walkways.
You get the sense that these structures were part of an entire city.
At its height, this was once the capital of a formidable dynasty that mysteriously vanished, leaving behind an extraordinary treasure trove that lay forgotten for 1,000 years.
When it was rediscovered, that became the beginning of a different kind of tragedy.
If you look, you can see these pedestals, but it looks like something is missing.
The treasures of this place would be plundered in what some people have called the greatest art heist in history.
The mastermind operated in plain sight, masquerading as a friend of the Cambodian people.
He was warm, he was funny, and so he was a brilliant con man.
But his luck would eventually run out.
Dr. Ia Darith is an archaeologist and expert on this site. He first came here in 2005 and has been unearthing its secrets ever since.
I was astonished to see these ancient temples. They'd been built here more than 1,000 years ago. We estimate that around 10,000 workers were involved in building this capital city.
The origin of this lost world dates back to the birth of a great civilization.
The Khmer Empire began to come together in about 900 CE when a leader named Jayavarman began to unite various warring tribes into a large entity like a modern state.
But just over a century later, it was hit by a power struggle, with Jayavarman IV emerging as the potential new leader of the Khmer people. He needed an impressive city to prove his superiority, so he built this, Kake.
He cemented his power with deliberately ambitious construction projects.
In order for a location to be considered a capital, it had to have a pyramid-shaped temple with multiple levels. This was a competition to showcase the leader Jayavarman IV's power.
It would have been furnished with priceless objects, including statues revered by the Khmer people.
The statues in Cambodia are important symbols of our respect for our ancestors and those who ruled before us.
By 928, Jayavarman's rivals were no more, and he proclaimed himself the sole emperor at Kok Kay.
But Jayavarman IV's reign would be short-lived. He died in 941, and in the political shifts that followed, the Khmer capital was relocated. That, coupled with a likely water shortage, left his city abandoned.
Kok Kay would remain hidden for almost 1,000 years, but when it was rediscovered, it opened the door to some very nefarious characters.
In the late 19th century, after French explorers stumbled upon the remains of Kok Kay, they documented the site, including its numerous statues. But a century later, in 1975, when Cambodia was taken over by the communist Khmer Rouge regime, the country and this ruin were cut off from the world until the late 1990s.
As the country recovered slowly, it was becoming clear that it wasn't just the Cambodian people who had suffered. Their ancient history had been destroyed and ravaged.
Hundreds of temples were looted, and at Kok Kay, virtually every statue was missing.
In 2012, lawyer Bradley J. Gordon, an American based in Cambodia, was called in to help bring them back.
I've been hired by the Department of Justice to track down stolen Cambodian antiquities. My assignment was to find the smuggling network, and we were just focused on one statue, the Duryodhana statue.
1 year earlier, the statue had gone up for auction at Sotheby's in New York with a list price of $2 to $3 million.
It was a 500-pound sculpture of a mythical Hindu warrior, and it was taken from Kok Kay.
After a tip-off from the Cambodian government that this was a stolen artifact, the U.S. Department of Justice stopped the sale and opened an investigation.
We interviewed more than 100 people. We found one man in particular who remembered seeing it at Kok Kay village on an ox cart. But we also started to realize that many people we were talking to knew a lot more than just about that one statue.
As Bradley dug deeper, it appeared the widespread theft of treasures from Kok Kay could be linked back to one man.
I came across the name of this dealer, Douglas Latchford. He was a well-known character when it came to the sale of Cambodian antiquities.
He was this charming guy. He presented himself as almost an amateur archaeologist. The idea that he might be a kind of kingpin of an international looting scandal was really shocking.
Latchford was born in British India and moved to Thailand in the 1950s. From there, he began searching the ancient ruins of Cambodia and became obsessed with the statues at this site.
To me, Douglas Latchford was the shadow king of Kok Kay. He was behind one of the greatest art crimes in history.
Bradley's investigation revealed that Latchford had used his contacts and knowledge of the region to exploit the chaos of the Khmer Rouge period to make himself rich. For 40 years, from his home in Bangkok, he organized gangs of Cambodian looters to smuggle out statues. The reward was so great, the looters were willing to risk their lives to get their hands on the ancient treasures.
Calling these blood antiquities makes a lot of sense because they definitely have blood attached to them. There were gun battles happening. They were fighting over the statues. And so we've heard stories about individuals being killed out here at Kok Kay.
It's estimated that Latchford's gangs stole up to 100 statues from Kok Kay alone.
We know that from one billionaire client, he sold him $35 million of statues. That's just one client. Latchford had many.
His customers were private collectors, but also museums, including the world-renowned Met in New York and the British Museum.
He was even knighted by the Cambodian government after donating a number of statues to the National Museum.
Latchford had fooled the world, and in the process, earned himself around $100 million. But the volume of evidence was adding up, and his time was running out. In 2019, U.S. federal investigators made their move because the attempted sale of the stolen Duryodhana statue was going to take place at an American auction house.
He was indicted by the U.S. government for the trafficking in stolen Cambodian antiquities. Douglas Latchford escaped justice. He died in his late 80s, and he didn't serve any time for these incredibly massive crimes he carried out.
Bradley and his team didn't give up the fight to get back what belonged to the Cambodian people.
We entered into negotiations with the Latchford family. We were dealing mostly with Douglas's daughter. During the negotiations, Julia Latchford did the right thing. She agreed to give back everything.
Now, of course, there remains a huge problem of identifying and returning the hundreds of other Cambodian antiquities that Latchford peddled over the years, but that's underway.
Our restitution team has already successfully brought home about 300 objects. We know that there are more out there, especially from Gokay. I think for the rest of my life, I will be working on this, and it will be far from over.
Today, Gokay is still revered as a place of worship by the local people. Meanwhile, in July 2024, 14 of its statues were finally returned to the National Museum of Cambodia.
For the Cambodian people, these statues are not artwork. They're not Picassos, they're not Van Goghs. They're living, they're spirits. So they feel very strongly that the statues were taken out of the house, out of the family, and now they need to come back.
In northern France, near the Belgian border, a bizarre collection of structures litters the landscape.
It's an area covered in rolling hills and sprawling farms. But up on one ridgeline is a massive metal saucer tilted on one side, almost like a UFO crash there.
This huge, heavy piece of steel has been popped up like a bottle cap. What power was required to knock that loose?
The land is scarred and riddled with craters. It looks as if a violent and terrible event has taken place.
A short distance away is a building that at first seems unrelated. Yet further investigation reveals they are intimately connected.
When you go inside, you realize that most of this site is actually underground, and it is enormous.
We see bunk beds, crumbling walls, twisted metal.
This was clearly a military site on a massive scale.
This marvel of 20th century technology became the pride of France that came before its fall.
In northern France is the fallen symbol of a nation vanquished by a powerful enemy.
The first time I came to La Ferté, I was 10 years old. It was a school visit.
Benjamin Dumont is part of an association dedicated to preserving the memory of this site. He was inspired to return when he understood its importance to history.
I have been here for 15 years now. What happened at La Ferté is a story that touches people in different ways.
That story began after Europe was engaged in a conflict that had grave consequences for future generations.
After World War I, French leaders began to debate how to best prepare for what they saw as a second inevitable conflict with Germany.
They therefore began to construct this line of defenses that would straddle the demarcation between Germany and France and protect France from an attack.
It was called the Maginot Line and was named after France's Minister of War, André Maginot, who ordered its construction. By 1938, the line of fortifications was complete. This section was called l'ouvrage de la Ferté.
The result was meant to be invulnerable, both to airplane bombing and to tank fire.
If a French soldier can stand in a dome with a machine gun and shoot Germans all day, that makes the French soldier more powerful. The technology is a substitute for manpower, and the technology is gonna save lives in the next war. Of course, it didn't work.
In 1940, the Nazis invaded France, and the nation's defenses would be put to the test. But there had been a major oversight in the French design. They never expected the Germans to invade through Belgium, and this part of the Maginot Line had been left vulnerable to attack.
The idea is they're going to armor the whole border of France, but then budget cuts. It's expensive.
There wasn't enough money to fully fortify this section of the line. And this was a fact the Nazis were all too aware of. On May 18, 1940, the Germans began pounding l'ouvrage de la Ferté.
The French soldiers stationed as the garrison there fell under the command of Lieutenant Maurice Bourguignon.
With only around 100 troops, he was left to fight a battle against the Nazis he could never win.
The Germans have got 88mm anti-tank guns. These high-velocity artillery pieces are capable of drilling rounds right into those steel domes. We can see the scars.
On May 18th alone, 8,000 shells fell on the wall, on the block here. It was extremely violent.
But worse was to come.
The German forces had dug trenches up the sides of the hill, reaching the gun emplacements.
The Germans put 40 kilos of explosives on the side of the turret. And it's these 40 kilos of explosives that lifted the top off the turret, which dropped back down.
Once the fort's defenses had been breached, the German attackers began to drop bombs and smoke down inside.
Fire raged throughout the fort, detonating munitions and filling the passages with smoke.
It was clear the battle was over, and Lieutenant Bourguignon made a desperate plea for help.
Bourguignon requested an evacuation order from his superiors several times, and systematically this evacuation order was refused.
Lieutenant Bourguignon wanted to save his people, and the general comes back, "Your fortress is like a submarine, and you are going to go down with the ship."
The French soldiers had no choice but to retreat to the lowest levels of the fallen stronghold.
Around 50 soldiers arrived in this gallery and joined 40 others already there.
They put on their gas masks and try to survive.
The vast majority of the fortress's soldiers died in this gallery on the morning of May 19th. 12 hours after the German attack began, it's over.
The myth of the Maginot Line's strength had been shattered. and the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive.
The Germans are able to say that superior German technology and German racial superiority overcame the vaunted Maginot Line.
One German leaflet read, "The Maginot Line is a mass grave for all those who defend it. There's no way of resisting the German army. Stop fighting, lay down your arms."
In the chaos that followed, Lieutenant Bourguignon was accused of betraying his country.
In June, the Germans gave the French soldiers a burial. 14 of them were not named. Among those unidentified was Lieutenant Bourguignon.
Rumors swirled that he had deserted his men or even collaborated with the Germans to hand over the fort.
This was a theory that had some currency during the war and immediately after.
But one man was determined to find out the truth and clear his name. In 1940, Hitler's Nazi forces overran this French military stronghold along the Maginot Line. Soon after, rumors spread that the man in command, Lieutenant Maurice Bourguignon, had deserted his post when no trace of his body was found.
When Bourguignon died in 1940, his only son Yves was just 5 years old. But years later, Yves wanted to know what happened to his father.
Yves worked tirelessly to contact German war veterans, hoping one of them might know something.
33 years after the fateful German assault, his prayers were answered.
Wilhelm Pennemann had been a German sub-officer at the time, and he'd dealt with the bodies. In 1973, he showed Bourguignon's son where the missing bodies were buried.
They exhumed the shallow grave, identifying some by their ID tags. Bourguignon's body was confirmed by his uniform stripes.
It was discovered that Lieutenant Bourguignon had not deserted his men. Posthumously, he was given the Legion of Honor, which is France's highest military order.
Today, the site is open to the public and includes a small cemetery for those who gave their life defending France in its darkest hour. In the Welsh town of Tonopandi stands the relic of a time when this region was the center of a fierce rebellion.
This building looms large, and it's clearly from an era that's now been forgotten.
Inside, it's just this vast, cavernous space. There's nothing really to suggest, what it was used for.
Yet, within these walls, a desperate people mobilized against the might of the British Army.
The townspeople here tell stories of mounted cavalry marching down their streets. It must have felt like an occupation.
And for them, the treachery lay at the hands of one of Britain's most lauded politicians.
Winston Churchill is most remembered in history for leading Britain through the Second World War. But for some, his legacy is more complicated.
And he faced an impossible decision: do nothing or send in soldiers against his own citizens.
His decision still haunts the town to this day.
This place was the flashpoint. What happened here spread like wildfire.
Philip Rowlands grew up in this small Welsh town. His grandfather worked here in the early 1900s and told him stories of a very different place.
It was a little bit like the Klondike. People were coming in from everywhere. It was a vibrant, burgeoning community,
People flooded into Tonopandi and the surrounding valley to dig for a major commodity of the time: coal.
It's places like these that used to be the industrial heart of the country.
This coal field was the largest in Britain, and this town sat in the middle of it.
Charlie Chaplin apparently appeared as a young lad in one of the theatres back in the day. It would have been quite an interesting place to have been.
At the time, mining was one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and the pits in this valley were no exception.
Water would pool and fill the mine shafts, so they needed to constantly pump the water out to prevent it from flooding.
This is the Tonopandi Powerhouse. Built in 1905, it housed state-of-the-art machinery capable of pumping up to 5,000 gallons of water from the mines every minute.
Without these engines running, the mines would be unworkable.
But even with the powerhouse in place, it was still a risky business. The coal seam the miners excavated was one of the most dangerous in Britain, and they wanted their wages to reflect this.
It's gaseous, which means that it's especially volatile.
It wasn't uncommon for workers to end up dead from explosions, partial collapses, any number of accidents.
Meanwhile, the mine-owning cartel who controlled these coal fields refused to compensate for the dangers, despite their exorbitant profits.
They called the shots, and they would squeeze their workers as much as they could.
Years of hard work, injuries, and meager pay took a toll on a place like this. At some point, people were going to demand a change.
The miners had fought for years to receive a fair wage for their life-threatening work, but their pleas had been ignored. It was a scene all too familiar in mining centers across the world, including the US. And in Tonopandi, in 1910, came the final straw.
A new pit opened in the valley, and it came time to negotiate pay. Workers and management were immediately at odds.
The new pit was extremely difficult to mine, and the miners ended up with even less pay.
The haggling went on until the mine owners decided to force the issue.
On September 1st, 1910, the company locked out the entire workforce from one of their mines.
But the mine owners had underestimated the strength of a new workers' union.
Miners across the region responded by balloting for a strike. And on November the 1st, 12,000 men went out on strike.
Tensions were high, and the Tonopandi powerhouse had become a ticking time bomb. In 1910, the miners of Tonopandi in Wales had reached a breaking point and gone on strike, demanding higher wages. Only one pit was left operating in the area, and it relied on the Tonopandi powerhouse to keep it going. So on November 7th, angry workers descended upon the facility, determined to force the crucial powerhouse to shut down.
8,000 striking miners began to gather in the town, with their sights set on the powerhouse, still churning away.
But the police knew the strikers were coming and had prepared for the assault by drafting in 100 extra officers. A tense standoff ensued.
The whole situation was balancing on a knife's edge, and then a stone came crashing through one of the windows.
The scene quickly turned violent, and a riot erupted in town.
After repeated baton charges, police drove strikers back just before midnight.
Yet the police were terrified they would be overrun by the strikers and made a frantic call to the government in London for help. The man in charge of Homeland Affairs at the time was Winston Churchill, 30 years before he became Prime Minister.
Churchill had authorized police forces from London and Bristol to maintain order, but it was becoming clear this wasn't just going to go away.
The next day, the riots didn't subside. In fact, they escalated. People were smashing in windows, breaking into shops. It was a mess.
Churchill was faced with a tough decision: appease the miners or send in the army to crush the uprising. he chose to use military force against his own people. At 1:20 a.m. on November 9th, 2 days after the riots began, Churchill dispatched a British cavalry squadron to restore order.
This was a big call to make, one that was guaranteed to be contentious.
Not only were there hundreds of police in the streets, but now there were armed troops alongside them too.
The miners faced such an overwhelming force, they had no choice but to back down.
The strikers had to go back, slowly drift back, because they didn't have any money. And children were starving, their wives were starving.
The line had been crossed, and that would never be forgotten. These weren't foreign enemies. These were his own countrymen.
Winston Churchill was vilified here for many years. The stories go when the news showed pictures of Churchill doing the worst, people would boo.
The Tonopandi powerhouse continued operating until 1966. And today, following the decline of Welsh coal mining, only one mine remains in use.
That's the sad part. We are losing our legacy, and we're losing our memory of things. We are trying to raise the awareness of the rich and unique heritage of this area, that people should be proud